What did you learn about an odd unique person that made you say I get you now? Have a friend who would be happy for a few months, would tell me he loves me, would wanna see and talk to me and generally be a happy guy that I loved, then he would just not talk to me for months and whenever I saw him he'd be moody or sad or down, would tell me he doesn't actually love me but he does still wanna be my friend despite how he was acting, me being me, massively overthought a ton about what I'd done wrong he had done wrong. I consulted other people, ones that knew him and ones that didn't as to what I should do. One night he was out with some other friends and got absolutely plastered. He then drunk dialed me and told me that he has bipolar disorder and that's why he had been acting how he did. I'm the only person outside of his family to know. He hasn't let his university know. He didn't let high school know. His best friend who he's known for way longer than me doesn't know. His girlfriend doesn't even know. Kinda makes me confused about how he feels about me and it makes our friendship kinda tough. But I love him so I stick it out. When I was in college I was partnered up with a strange dude for an assignment. He had a really terrible odor, smelled like BO mixed with dirty hamster cage and he always wore a black trench. My so had actually gone to high school with him and said the guy was pretty ostracized for his smell. He was always friendly with me and I thought he was a pretty cool guy actually. He still lived with his parents and I ended up going over there so we could work on our project together. Oh my god. Think of the worst episode of Hoarders involving animals and that was this guy's life. Animal it mixed with cedar shaving covered the floor. There were litter boxes stacked 2 feet high with it and had a 10-foot radius of it around the boxes. I was shocked but of course didn't say anything. After I got home the smell clung to me. I felt so bad for the guy and his little sister. His parents really disadvantaged him by raising him in that environment. That smell was his identity in a lot of ways. We developed a friendship although I never went back to his parents' house again. Last I heard he had gotten his own place and was doing well. The new guy at work, who I thought was weird and a little annoying. He greets me overly exuberantly, asks our managers long drawn out questions, explains pointless things that didn't need explaining, doesn't always finish his projects on time. Mainly I was annoyed with him because he'd start irrelevant conversations with me while I was in the middle of projects and didn't have time to talk. He looks a lot younger than he is and I assumed he was just out of high school and still in the awkward phase. I was smoking a cigarette outside during my break one day and he came outside to smoke. He tells me he's a recovering pill addict and just passed his 1-year anniversary of being sober. He also is a single father and has a young son, who is the reason he got sober. He doesn't smoke around his kid and quit everything else cold turkey at once, including alcohol, because he didn't want his little one being around it. I'm a recovering addict too and instantly in my head I was like that explains it. I realized that all his behavior is in fact pretty typical of someone recovering from drug abuse and I actually found it admirable that not only did he get a job and get sober to be a good father to his kid, but also that he had the courage to admit that to a co-worker. I gained a lot of respect for him after that. I got to know this guy through my boyfriend. They have been friends forever. He's little bit socially challenged, tells jokes at wrong times, talks and talks and talks even though the other person is clearly bored and says what he thinks, no matter if it's offensive. He is weirdly obsessed about things and knows a lot about them, like cars. And oh how he just talks about them so long you feel like you would rather get hit by a car. His friends tell him straight to his face, shut up, you've been talking for ages. They've been friends forever. But I thought it was kind of rude at first. Then I realized he appreciates it. He has autism and is really bad with social cues. I understood it all suddenly. Got to know him better and it's easy to see why he is part of that friend group. You couldn't find more loyal and trustworthy friend and when he isn't nervous, it's actually great to have conversations with him. He's absolutely great guy if you make the effort and get to know him. When I had hard time with my boyfriend, his best friend, he actually texted me how I'm doing and told it's going to be alright. Amazing gesture. And everything turned out alright, like he said. My fiance was kind of spoiled as a kid. His parents put him and his brother before themselves all the time, and constantly praised them and drove them places whenever they wanted and saved up for awesome family vacations, etc. Don't get me wrong, I'm looking at having the best in-laws I could possibly ask for and I love them. but for a while I did criticize them for sheltering my son and never making him do things he didn't want to. But his mom is a therapist, and once she was talking about her experience working with kids in the system, all with different stories of abuse and sexual assault that must be heart-wrenching to hear as a parent. His parents just wanted them to have the best childhood possible, knowing that some kids just don't get that. My best friend is a bit crazy. Her sense of humor is a bit off, and people never know if she's kidding or not, me included sometimes. I think she makes a joke in her head, makes a follow-up joke to that, makes a follow-up joke to that, and only says the third thing. She also is quite Christian with a big fascination with Israel. She's smart, but she occasionally does weird things with her diet, keeps kosher, cuts out gluten, decides a certain food is bad. Being friends with her is always an adventure. I've had several last-minute cross-country road trips because of her. Anyways, I always thought she was crazy. Then I met her parents. They're Christian fundamentalists, similar to Pentecostals. Her father spent all of dinner lecturing us on random Bible verses, and a couple hours telling me about his campaigns in local elections. They also live in the middle of nowhere. After meeting them and seeing how she was raised, I found her to be surprisingly sane. I later met her grandparents, which lent a whole new level to understanding her family. Her grandmother is also a fundamentalist, but more, and her grandfather is an atheist, happily married for decades. Despite it, I love her, but her family is something else. Can't wait for her wedding next year. Learning about autism made me realize that my dad probably has a mild form, and that could be why he does some of the things he does. Ex-co-worker at a factory I worked at. Annoying as duck, super childish, brown-nosing her way to supervisor type of person. Very immature. Her husband worked at the same factory. I learned over time that she was 25, he was 50, and they had a 10-year-old daughter. MFW, I realized a 40-45-year-old knocked up a 15-year-old and they kept the kid. All of her itchiness kind of melted away to insecurity because she probably didn't finish high school and probably had her emotional development stunted at 15 because of the whole baby thing. I took her annoying nature with a grain of salt after that and didn't push back on her as hard as I did before after I put that together. My friend. Before we were friends I knew her as that short emo girl. Well, it turns out the reason she was emo, thought she was ugly and horrible, was simple. That's all her parents ever told her. It made me cry when she told me. I had an uncle who was a bit of a black sheep in the family. He was the guy at the family reunion with the ponytail who would sneak off to smoke pot and sleep outside in a tent. He also moved out of the Rust Belt to Colorado, so we never saw the guy. The rest of that side of my family is super duper conservative and wholesome. I moved out west out of college and hung out with him a couple of times. The fact of the matter is he was living the good life. He owned a cabin on top of a mountain, had solar panels, and even a green toilet. I also learned he suffered from night terrors, which was pretty embarrassing for him. He actually lived the good life. Had a great support network of loose women and bearded outdoor types. Unfortunately, he died in his cabin a few years back. And he did live with someone, he probably would have gotten to the ER on time. Oh well. There's this guy who constantly makes suicide jokes. They were pretty good, but he went above and beyond with them. One day, this really annoying kid in the class says, "Your parents are disabled." Kid was known for consistently insulting anyone, calling them down eyes. "Your mum's a virgin, not sure how that works," etc. The suicide joke kid laughs, then says that his parents are in fact disabled. I think I'm the only one that actually realized then why he made all these jokes then. It was to help him get along. My uncle's always been a bit of a conspiracy theorist. My mom mentioned a few years ago that he was Oliver North's driver when he was in the army, and suddenly his fascination with conspiracies made a whole lot more sense. For those of you who aren't familiar with recent American history, Oliver North was a general who got caught selling weapons to Iran so the government could funnel the money to terrorist groups in Nicaragua. It was a huge scandal, and my uncle personally knew the main figure in it. No wonder he started to not take things at face value. Finding out why Britney had her breakdown. Soon as she explained why she shaved her head, I fully understood. There was a girl I went to high school with who seemed to never quite get it. who was always a few steps behind everyone else. Never got the joke right away, just generally seemed a little bit off. Senior year she began wearing her hearing aids to school. She wasn't dumb or slow, she had severe hearing loss and had been attempting to get by without her aids for years for fear people would make fun of her. I never understood my mother completely, but my first eureka moment came when I read Anne of Green Gables. My mother lived in her own world. This I knew from a very early age, but I couldn't grasp what world it was until I read that book. Then things began to make sense. My mother was badly treated by her mother, and became very narcissistic, and she found her escape in books. Anne was her favorite and that world was where she lived. She became extremely angry when events of the real world intruded on how she wanted it to be. She held grudges forever for it. I was a very scared and confused little girl. I have a friend who had a really odd way of pacing around and constantly fidgeting, clapping, but only on some days randomly. Come to find out they were prescribed Adderall for ADHD and would sometimes randomly forget to take it before school. After learning this, a lot of other weird or unexplained things I saw and heard about her doing made sense. My uncle was never diagnosed with autism as it was totally not even considered a thing back in the 1940s and 50s. People on the functioning side were considered slow and the non-functioning were considered, and I apologize for the term, but mentally retarded. It now makes total sense why he is obsessed with model trains and airplanes. He's lived a great life though, got married and had 2 non-autistic kids and even got his pilot license and used to fly Cessnas. When I was growing up, my mom was very anxious. I had a cold when I was a teenager and woke up in the middle of the night because apparently she had called 911 because I had a fever in my sleep. Even now when I'm in my late 20s, she calls me up randomly just to see where I am and if I'm safe. I found out in my teens that her dad died under mysterious circumstances. There was a good chance he was purged by the Soviets. A friend of mine doesn't drink. Not a sip. Not a gulp. Not a toast. Not a non-alcoholic beer. Probably doesn't even put rum in pancake batter. Doesn't tolerate drinking in a partner. It's not the weirdest thing out there, but you know, it's kind of normal in our culture to have a drink here or there, and very normal for college students to drink. One night out I was drunk and filterless and asked why that is so, and they told me that they grew up with their grandparents because their parents were working in another country, and that their grandparent was an abusive, alcoholic, PTSD-stricken war veteran, who later died due to his alcoholism. So after that, I can definitely understand why alcohol is such a huge no-no. Well, when I tell people I have Asperger's autism, they often react that way, like oh that makes sense. We had some real issues with a client who wanted our software to work in a way it wasn't designed to. We couldn't really get clear specifications from him, and the requirements would change dramatically whenever he came up with a new way of working. Eventually, the project landed on my desk and I put my tallest heels on and went across to his office to figure out a solution. We walked into the conference room and were waiting for a few other people. In the meantime, he decided to tell me and the IT manager about a new technique he was going to use to interview people. So imagine I'm interviewing you. Pause. He says, and I ask you to write something on the whiteboard for me. What would you write? I told him I'd write my name. The spelling is unique and having it written up there and visible might just make an interviewer more likely to remember me. Well, I wouldn't hire you, he tells me. Probably for the best since I have no relevant skills or experience. No, it's not that. You can't follow instructions. Interesting. I'm ex-military. I am still working on reprogramming myself to question instructions when they sound odd. An ex of mine could make do crazy things if he sounded sufficiently authoritative when I was tired. One thing I am excellent at is following instructions. The client picks up a pen, writes something on the whiteboard, and points at it triumphantly. And in that moment, both he and the whole project made sense to me. My dad was becoming hazy and would seem to lose focus easily as I grew older, tending to be very forgetful. By the time I was leaving high school he had almost become delirious and it was hard to explain why he did certain things. We found out he has mild Alzheimer's. I really love my dad and I miss being able to see him healthy and at his best. One of best friends in middle school, still my best friend. Used to act almost completely opposite to the rest of us as far as gender relations are concerned. We are all guys and used to try and pick up girls, and the few times it happened he just wasn't into it. He never dated any girl and all his friends outside our group were girls. Our group of friends never really thought anything of it because he was our amigo. Fast forward to April Fool's Day this year and we get a group call from our friend. It's been about 2 or 3 years since we have all been together, military families, but we still stay in contact fairly often. Our group's sense of humor is kinda twisted I guess, and we never miss a chance to roast each other. Our friend in question comes out to say that he has made decisions to undergo 6 change and name change plus the whole 9 yards. One friend in the group call immediately starts laughing because this is very typical content for our group. Our friend was very serious but wasn't offended from the reaction. That was the whole light bulb moment for my group. It explained our interaction as friends almost in a sort of revelation experience. We are all still friends, even closer from this. The best part was it was April Fool's Day and I think that was the point. Note, didn't mean to offend anyone who is transgender. I hear about this sort of thing all the time but this is my first exposure to it I guess. Just not real clear how to address the past and the future in terms of him or her. Thanks all for reading. There was a guy in line behind me in the grocery store who stared intently as I unloaded each item from my cart. It was like he had never seen anyone remove items from a grocery cart in his entire life. As I was taking off my shoes later that night, I realized you could see straight down my shirt when I bent over. Had a buddy who would eat everyone's leftovers. It got to the point where if you were going to throw away food, you would ask him if he wanted it first. He got picked on for this quite a bit, the way kids get picked on, until another friend explained his situation. His parents had gone back to their home country for medical reasons and he, 14 at the time, and his older brother, 16 at the time, had to fend for their own food. It made so much sense and was a little sobering knowing that's something most of us didn't have to think or worry about. Since finding out, I went out of my way to make sure he was invited to my place to eat with my family for every holiday until recently when he got his own place and started his own family. There was this woman who was a regular customer at a former job of mine. She always spoke in this over the top, gratingly super sweet way that felt very fake and really bugged me. I'm from New England. We aren't happy nice unless there's a damn good reason. One day she stopped in and struck up conversation. She told me she had just returned from the Midwest where she had attended her father's funeral. She told me this in the same overly sweet tone as always, but with tears welling up in her eyes. I realized in that moment that she wore that mask of happiness as a way of protecting herself from the sadness and darkness of the world, and that it was as valid a method as any to do so. After that I found I was able to see her as a real person, with joy and sadness and all of the complexity of life, rather than the two-dimensional C character I had written her off as. I still get a little choked up when I think of her in that moment. A lot of people think my grandpa has dementia, yet he stores most of his information in different folders. He has lists for everything. In each of his bags, there is a list with a set of items fitting into the given bag. If you were to ask him what he puts into his bags, he couldn't immediately answer. He just looks into the given bag, checks the list and is then able to tell you what is supposed to be in the given bag. The memories available to him are memories, which are necessary for him to function in daily life. I had a co-worker that started working at the company the same time as me. We went through training together and I really liked him. He seemed cool, just a little quiet. Over the past couple of months I kept trying to make plans to grab a drink after work and hang out, but I kept getting turned down. I couldn't understand why he was always so busy after work, didn't want to hang. We got along really well during the day. I sort of started to feel a bit offended. Anyways, he quit a couple weeks ago. I found out later from his sister that he quit because he has consistently been making 3x more than we were getting paid by gambling professionally. On all of these weekends that I was trying to hang out with him, he was flying all over the country playing blackjack and counting cards. On any average weeknight when I was watching Netflix or hitting the gym, he was being kicked out casinos. I have an acquaintance that I've actually known since elementary school. Recently we spent some time together and I found out that her childhood was much like mine, with abusive negligent parents and a mother who was in competition with her daughter. This explains a lot, and had I known this 20 years ago we probably could have been better friends. Since both of our coping mechanisms ended up being drugs, alcohol and healthy decisions, it's probably better for both of us. We didn't know this until now, but it still explained so much. Girl in college totally ignored my, also female, small talk before class. Odd, the next day her American Sign Language interpreter came to class with her. She was deaf, not a snob. One of the kids in my class's sophomore year of college had super long hair, looked like Jesus kinda hair and beard, and was well spoken but always just seemed off. He vaguely mentioned sleeping in a bathroom on campus some nights, and I started to think something was up. Maybe problems at home. I was kinda right. It turns out he escaped a cult. I suddenly went from thinking he was a little socially awkward to being one of the bravest people I'd ever met when I heard his story. More generally, I feel like this realization is the most helpful thing to experience with anyone. Once that odd thing that someone does is traced back, makes it an awful lot easier to understand them. Whether it's why that person attempts to dominate conversations, feels the need to correct subtle factual inaccuracies, recedes in group situations but is outgoing one-to-one, goes extended periods without texting, whatever it is, there's always a reason. Those moments of realization, as you describe, are always so instructive. I find the hardest thing is trying to remind yourself of this when you're frustrated with someone for one of those things. Remember hanging out my friend James. We both like rock, metal, and some emo music time to time. We decided to ditch class one time and sat around a tree next to the boy locker room. He talks about new bands we listen to. I asked him how he got into the genre, and he told while he was young his family was already broken with drug abuse mostly, and he decided to listen to the radio for comfort, switching through all the channel and stumble upon some rock song that he felt relatable and emotional. Sometimes he asked himself why does he still live and wish someone will stay with him to make him feel needed instead being worthless. I never felt that close to a friend before. A year into dating my ex and he told me he had Asperger's. Made so much sense in hindsight, but I had no clue until then. I'm not sure if this falls into odd, but it's not something most people run into every day. A close friend of mine is married to someone who is genderqueer. We recently had conversation about it that gave me better understanding. They asked me if I understood how sexuality can be on a spectrum, meaning you may be attracted to different people or different sexes and that it's not always black or white. It is the same with gender. It can be on a spectrum as well, and there are different variations of gender. I found this to be an incredibly helpful way to think of it. Neighbor is off. Smokes a ton of pot. Has serious drinking concerns. Doesn't see anything wrong with either. Even brags to me, knowing full well I am an addictions counselor. Brain injury from workplace. Makes a ton of sense. I feel for him. I got really lucky with my brain injury that I am not that ducked up. My little brother. Context for further understanding. We're Asian, so academics is really important. Both of my parents are doctors, and I was pressured since small to consistently perform well in school. So I did. Naturally, my parents expected the same from my brother, but he can never cope with his studies. He failed most subjects, from kindergarten all the way up to primary school. He'll always be the last student when it comes to ranking. Turns out he's dyslexic and has ADD. He can't perform well in school because he needs help, so my parents gave him all the meds and help he need. He started to get really well in his studies, even getting straight A's once in a big national exam. There's a lot of things I don't understand about him, but I'll always try to help. He's my brother. I try to encourage his interests, support his dreams. I don't know much about dyslexia and ADD, but I want him to know that I will always have his back, no matter what. I once knew a guy with super overprotective parents. They had all boys, so it seemed a little weird that the parents enforced such strict curfews. Anyway, one day years later the mother revealed to me after some wine that she was sexually assaulted at a party as a teen, and her relative that knew what was going on didn't bother to stop it. So yeah, made me understand why she didn't want her teen sons running around all night. I had a business contact who was very critical. difficult and clearly miserable. One day during a photo shoot I had the chance to ask one of her colleagues about her. Turned out she used to live in Australia. She was really happy. Her husband was a police officer and did well. Her teenage daughter was a sports star and doing well at school. Then her mother back in Britain got sick. Alzheimer's. She had to move back to look after her. Husband couldn't join the police here. Local school was it and her daughter was bullied for being foreign. Her mother got progressively worse and harder to care for, but just wouldn't die. At the time I knew her, the mother didn't recognize anyone, was basically incontinent and needed constant care. It made me want to cry and I felt horribly guilty for judging that poor woman. Not me, but a middle school English teacher I had told us this story. She once worked with an old guy who everyone thought was just really weird. Then one day he came in wearing short sleeves, and he had concentration camp numbers on his arm. My best friend started dating a 19-year-old and I was like, dude, you're terrible at math. Half my age plus 7 does not equal 19. But he explained to me she was one of those officious 20 going on 40 types while he missed out on all the traditional teenage experiences because his parents were hellbent on him getting into MIT. So instead of thinking him an oddball pervert, I understand his motivation. George W. Bush and going to Texas. As a Californian I was always a little bemused at what he would say and do and how he governed. Then I took a few days trip to Dallas, TX. There are billboards in view of the freeway advertising pornography, not just strip clubs, but the town was all very orderly. It gave me the feeling that you could do whatever you wanted to, but if you broke the law you would get the hammer. And just like that, Bush made sense. I had a buddy in college who would excessively pine after girls and read way too much into tiny details. That sort of stuff. Unnecessary drama seen more typically in high school. We learned that he was homeschooled and that kinda gave some insight into his interactions.